Hi everyone, I hope you all are having an amazing time so far. Welcome back to session 4 of Unconvention Day 2. So for the next session, we have Srinivas Ramanujam, CEO of Wilgrow, moderate an interesting panel on moving the needle in agriculture, creating startup impact at scale. So over to you, Srini.
Thank you, Anusha. So agri-tech has been a passion of mine, and I think I owe it to a lot of the folks in this panel. So as I explain something which has been sort of puzzling me, puzzling us at Wilgrow as we work in agriculture for the longest time, I want to have this discussion, maybe pull out some insights, which can help entrepreneurs who've been doing some fantastic work till now on solving one of these big conundrums on how we can move the needle and start creating larger scale startups. Yeah. So with me, this is no particular order. I have Professor Rakesh Basant, Professor Ayan Ahmedabad, who's also on the board of CIIE.co. He's been intimately associated with the startup ecosystem, supporting, advising CIIE for almost a decade. I have Mark Khan, who has been an inspiration for me, one of my earliest advisors when I started moving in understanding agri-tech. I have Hemendra, who is continuous and someone I reach out to every time I have a doubt in the space. And we have Pratik, who earlier had been incubated at Wilgrow and now has scaled and I think has done some fantastic work along with his team in mobile cold storage and now in solar pumps and such. So what we want to talk about today and what I hope we can pull out of the session is to see how do we get the startup, a startup to start scaling up? How can they build partnerships? How can they start looking at ideas beyond competition to see how they can collaborate and co-opt? And at the same time, there are lots of us, ecosystem players and funders and such. What is the role that we can play in making this ecosystem amenable and supportive of scale? So as we examine this, as we try to understand this issue, I'm hoping that we can take this out and we can start practicing it. So I'm just going to jump right in and ask each of the panelists with me a specific question, and then we will build a conversation from there. Professor Basant, you've done a lot of study in this space. You studied the signs of success. I want to sort of understand from you what are obvious gaps as you've been studying this space in policy, in innovation, and even in market opportunity.
Thank you, Srini. I have not been very actively involved in talking to agri startups in recent times. So I will stick to some larger macro issues that I think are important. And given the heterogeneity of agri startups, it is quite difficult to identify common factors that constrain exploitation of market opportunities and scaling up. So I'll focus on 4 things that I think are salient. And these are infrastructure, linkages and partnerships that you've already mentioned, some policy issues and human capital. And to my mind, success of agri startups is linked to the way they are able to manage these issues. Now, in the context of infrastructure, quite a few things are usually said about cold chain storage and warehousing, and their absence creates bottlenecks. But I, as an economist, still feel that the problems with the old-fashioned infrastructure like roads, power, internet connectivity are still critical and adversely affect scaling up. And since no startup can create alternatives for these, it becomes a major kind of a bottleneck. The other thing which can be broadly included as a significant part of infrastructure in our context is data systems that contain information on land, farm characteristics, and so on. These are very critical for many innovative applications. Like digital solutions, for example, can only run on data-driven models, but there are few large or centralized data systems that are available for startups to leverage. So one needs to worry about these broader infrastructure issues. The other thing, as you referred, are very critical partnerships and linkages with different ecosystem players, which are obviously critical for scaling up. Because most of these startups are not really substituting what the large corporates or the government institutions are doing. They are mostly either complementing the existing offerings or enabling them to be more efficacious by enhancing their efficiency through better modes of delivery, etc. So linkages with existing players are very important for scaling up, as these they provide access to critical complementary assets and resources for them to exploit market opportunities. But this ecosystem, as it has evolved so far, is not mature enough to foster such linkages. There seems to be some movement in this respect, but success will happen only when large private players and the existing government systems are open to a variety of partnerships to improve the reach of startups and reduce their asset heaviness. Probably, as you mentioned in passing, funders and incubators can play a critical role. The third, which to my mind is fairly critical, is the role of policies. And most of us know that many existing policies make a variety of business models untenable. For example, startups who provide advisory services or focus on input efficiency, say irrigation or fertilizers, cannot charge decent prices, and many inputs are highly subsidized. And the farmers don't see much value in utilizing some of these kinds of services. And this makes the startups look for linkages that will help them earn revenue, say with an input company or somebody because somebody in the system has to pay for these offerings. Such linkages are difficult to build, but even if linkages are built, they can potentially be a conflict of interest between what the input supplier company may be wanting to push and the quote unquote objective offerings of the startup. And for-profit business venture find it difficult to survive in these kind of situations. Also, this so-called customer versus consumer dichotomy at times results in a variety of compromises. Finally, I would like to mention the criticality of human capital for agri startups. Uh, and it is accentuated by the decentralized nature of agriculture. In most situations, it is virtually impossible to reach out to farmers without intermediaries, as transaction costs are enormously high. Aggregation therefore becomes critical, and FPOs are often seen as obvious partners. But whatever little I know about FPOs, very few FPOs have the human resources to handle market transactions and contracts in a professional manner. So that, to my mind, is a critical gap because aggregation is important. And perhaps some kind of innovative organizational forms wherein a somewhat hierarchical federation of FPOs could be created with a better equipped FPOs like, say, Sahyadri providing professional support can be sort of thought about. Before I stop, I wish to raise like a good teacher in a classroom, raise a conceptual issue with respect to the idea of scaling up. Uh, and I may be saying something which is already discussed in such forums and therefore may be irrelevant. To my mind, in the context of agri ventures, in fact, for all social impact ventures, should we not distinguish between scaling up and replicability? Given the high context specificity of agriculture, replicability to my mind might be a more desirable goal than scaling up, because scaling up may not be possible given the diversity. I'll stop here for now and come back later. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Basant, because for me, what I just took out is an interesting framework, and I'm going to use that to anchor the entire conversation. Actually, Mark, I want to use something that Professor highlighted, which is on data systems, because I think some of the earliest bets on where IoT, data systems, or even digital technologies were being deployed, or something that you foresaw, you even backed them. And I like the way Professor spoke about not a substitution, but complementing and increasing efficacy. So how has it worked out? I mean, how can we accelerate this improving efficacy? Because my guess is that this data is going to be consumed not by the farmer, but by someone else. How do you accelerate the rate of growth of these systems, or even adoption of these systems by the players in the value chain?
So, respectfully, I disagree with much of what the professor says. I think that much of it was true when we started Omnivore. I think that much of it was true even 5 years ago. I think that in the past couple of years, we are starting to see a shift where it is possible to get to scale without partnership. And I actually think it's entirely undesirable to look at replicability. That's like asking Facebook that they should be replicable by 1 million clones. You can't build a scalable business that way, nor can you raise capital that way, nor can you, reach the level of scale that you desire that way. Replicability is wonderful with respect to public sector extension, right? With respect to private initiatives, right? I'm not sure it's actually the goal. Let me clarify what I mean by all of this. When we started in this journey, okay, and many of us here have been on this journey for a long time, whether it is an Omnivore, an Avishkar, an Ankur, Hemendra in his various incarnations, we've all been part of this story, right, for the last decade. And I think of the story largely coming in sort of 3 phases. The first phase were various attempts to digitize India's agricultural economy with the huge caveat that the average farmer did not have any access to digital technology. They might have, right, a Nokia mobile phone, right? Feature phones were still new. And that was it. That was what we were working with in 2010, 11, 12, even 13, 14, really until I would say kind of 2015, 16. That was the environment that we built in. And so all of the startups from that vintage, by definition, could not look at going to farmers directly unless what they were selling was essentially kind of a CapEx product, a heavy sort of CapEx product, where you could justify building a field force to sell that product because you could make enough money from the sale of that product to recoup the costs of what you were building. That is EcoZen in a nutshell, but that's also companies like Mitra that we sold to Mahindra. That's also companies like Eruvaka, right? That was what we could do back then. And if you wanted to go beyond, right, CapEx sale, if you wanted to sort of reach a higher level of digitization, the only way you could do that was what we call B2B to F, business to farmer, right? What did that mean? It meant a company like Stellaps, digitizing the dairy space, did not go from farmer to farmer to farmer. They went to Hatson, they went to Heritage, they went to Creamline, they went to Nandini and NDDB and Amul, right? Because that was the only way you could access lakhs and millions of farmers. That was it. That was the only way you could do it. And by definition, B2B sales in an Indian context with domestic customers is freaking terrible. It is awful. It is a miserable slog. It is government tenders. It is 1 year buying processes. It's your working capital getting stuck for 12 months because no one will cut a damn check to pay you. And it's an L1 process for many of these players, especially the cooperatives. It sucks. There's no other way to put it. And it limited the scale of all of the businesses that went in that direction, right? If you look at the ones that managed escape velocity, let's take Crop In, right? Krishna Kumar's genius was selling outside of India, was doing the Zoho Freshworks plan and recognizing that it's better to build in India if you're doing B2B and sell outside than to try to sell domestically. And really, you've only seen tremendous B2B sales success in an Indian context domestically. Let's step out of Agri for a second, where it's been large scale SME sales, right, at relatively low price points, the tally model, but the digital versions of the tally model. Okay. Anytime you're dealing with a large institution, it is a miserable uphill slog. And so the companies of that vintage struggled with scale because, let's be honest, lousy, difficult corporate partners, right? That were, that made this harder than it needed to be. I think what started to happen in 2015, 16, 17 was you started to see the rise of full stack models, right? Agrostar, the Excel bets, Agrostar, Samanati, right? NinjaCart, which basically said, okay, this is a big problem, and the only way we can deal with it is to throw money at it as hard as we can, right? And overcome, right, all of the challenges and go full stack to reach the farmer. And so I think we saw a wave of full stack models at that time. And I think what has fundamentally changed in the last few years is you have probably average rural smartphone penetration, right? First of all, 4G became ubiquitous. Geo slashed the cost of everything. Handset costs collapsed. And I would argue that probably in the farm population, you've got 20, 25% smartphone penetration. It varies, let's be clear. But you have very high levels of smartphone penetration in more progressive groups within India's 13 crore farmers, right? So if we take the aquaculture farmers of India, 99% of them have a smartphone. If we take the sericulture farmers of India, say 95%. If we take horticulture farmers, I'd say 70%. It depends. The closer you are to the city, the more likely you have a smartphone. And if you take, say, dairying, I would say instead of being 20%, it might be 40%. All of this was simply not true a few years ago, right? It just wasn't, you could not begin to reach farmers at scale. And let's be clear, right? I'm not saying you can reach every farmer. I'm not saying, right, in Bastar with an Adivasi farmer farming 2 bigas, you can reach it. Like, you can't, okay? That's not gonna happen. That's gonna be a public sector, nonprofit kind of initiative. But if you're talking about the sub-segmentation of Indian agriculture, you can reach the groups that are more receptive to technology, increasingly and with greater ease every year. And so the ability to scale and scale efficiently, right? Not just by pounding money and throwing bodies at the problem, right? But with a digital reach, right? That is very, very different than it used to be. And I would even point to our portfolio company, Dehat, with an example of a hybrid model, right? Where Dehat is not trying to reach every farmer on their mobile phone, right? What they have is every single VLE in their network, and there are thousands, right? That boy in, 60 kilometers outside of Samastipur, right, has a smartphone and becomes the digital node that then the farmer is able to interface with, even if the farmer themselves doesn't. So I think we're playing in a very different environment. I think we're playing in a very different game, and I think it's changing very fast.
Thank you, Mark. For me, actually, it wasn't so different from what Professor was talking. I think there were some principles that we've sort of pulled in, but a consistent thread across is I see the need to be able to work with, say, a partner. Like you took the example of a wheelie, right? Someone has just understood, hey, I can't hire everyone. I probably need this chap on a commission. Someone else who is, the slog with the hats in, whether a hat's in likes it or not, someone else is going to say, I need some technology. So if I may, it's getting clearer that a lot of principles which exist in other, sectors, it could be retail, it could be manufacturing, those principles are seeping in here. Yeah, it's an argument. Hold on to that, because I'm going to ask that question to Hemendra. Because we've been talking about partnerships. We've also been talking about how can large commodity players use this, right? Because at the end of the day, whether you're doing full stack or you're throwing capex, you need someone to either aggregate for you or you need to break the bulk. I mean, that's the end of it, right? You just need to drive efficiencies, sweat your assets more. You might not be able to everything, And that's where you need to use assets that exist. So how do you see those partnerships? ThinkAg, you're one of the co-founders, is built on that bedrock too. Yeah.
Sure, Srini. Thanks for the question. And I will tend to agree and disagree in parts with both Professor Basant and Mark. Um, First and foremost, I still believe partnerships are critical to scale and will continue to be very, very critical to scale in times to come. There are only two ways I see a lot of agri-tech models scaling. One is either 80% of India's agriculture get digitized, or other ways to model becoming more full stack, in time to come. So of course, digitization is happening and it's happening faster than most of us think. And thanks to COVID, probably the momentum is far better than what it was 12 months ago. But having said that, I think full stacking of solution is extremely critical. And the reason I say this is if you're reaching out to a farmer, let's say farmer, let's take the farmer in Samastipur, which Mark was referring to, 1 hectare plot of land, maybe growing maize and paddy or wheat, earning 100,000 rupees a year. He may be buying inputs worth of 40,000 odd rupees. He may be taking a loan worth, let's say, another 40,000 rupees. So if I am just operating on one of the three dimensions, I'm probably making few hundred, at most a couple of thousand rupees. But if I start looking at farmer needs across all the dimensions of the market linkage, the inputs, the financing, the insurance, the data and advisory, the monetization potential, even from a smallholder farmer, is, I think, can be as much as, let's say, 7 to 10,000 rupees, which I think is extremely critical, because it's very important from a startup perspective is to go deep, rather than to go wide, particularly at the early stage of your life cycle, and when capital is a little bit of a struggle. So I think that's where a full stacking start making much more sense. Having said that, most of the ecosystem is at a juvenile stage, right? Most of the startups are under 3 to 4 years of their life cycle. So it's too much to expect from them to go full stack, even if capital is available. And I want to emphasize that I've seen with best of the capitalized startups, someone into input e-commerce trying to do credit miserably failed. Someone who's into financing trying to sell inputs, not a big success. And that's where, I believe, even if you have capital, the kind of skill set that you need to serve farmer needs are very, very different. And that's where partnerships become extremely critical. And let's break it down further. I think both Professor and Mark spoke about it. Uh, I would say the partnerships are needed maybe at 4 or 5 levels. One is more like peer-to-peer partnership, which is like one agri startup tying with another one. Uh, of course, a lot of startups, they are ambitious that they think they can solve almost all the farmer problems. But I think startups are getting smarter, and I'm seeing that partnership happening. I would say almost 70-80% of the ecosystem is collaborative. The 20% which is not probably will get collaborative, because there are the market dynamics and capital efficiency ratios looks very different when you become a little bit more collaborative. Second partnership I would say is with corporates and industry, and yes, it's a tough sell, but I would say things are changing again faster than most of us think. The kind of conversations I have had with corporates like Nestle, like Marico, like Godrej, Bayer, Hooler, is quite interesting. Most of them are trying to figure out a startup engagement program. I don't think anyone has cracked it at scale, but at least in terms of their awareness of the solution and the awareness of the fact that most of the innovations are going to come outside their own sort of organization, I think that is sort of seeping in. So I'm very sure that in time to come, we'll see a lot of industry startup partnerships, and we have had some success through ThinkAg, where we tried to catalyze some of these early days, but I'm very optimistic about that. I think the third is partnership with local ecosystem, like village level entrepreneurs, FPOs, as Professor was mentioning, MSMEs. I think that is a big lacuna. Of course, likes of Tata Trust, Syngenta Foundation, they're doing a great job in building the VLE ecosystem. Of course, likes of Dehat have done a tremendous job in working with micro entrepreneurs, likes of Food, etc. There are startups who have cracked it in parts, but I still see that there is gap. We need much more VLEs and models like HESA, Frontier Markets, who are recruiting this army of entrepreneurs, training them, and through that enabling a lot of products and services to farmers. I think we need many, many more of that happening now. FPOs, I think, of course, FPO ecosystem is as nascent as the startup ecosystem, but I find it a little surprising that typically what FPO problems are, like access to market, access to inputs, access to credit, access to data advisory, is essentially what startups are trying to solve for. But unfortunately, these two ecosystems don't talk to each other. I worked with IFC last year for a project in Maharashtra and spoke to about 20 odd FPOs. And I asked them to name 5 agri-tech startups. None of them could even name 2 or 3. So I found it very surprising, and that too in state of Maharashtra. So I think has to be some mechanism where we can bring these two ecosystems together. And third one is MSMEs. We know 90% of food processing in India is in MSME network. But it's again, the awareness about agri-tech, food tech is still very, very minimal. So I think that's where I think we need some bit of catalytic and public intervention. The fourth one, I would say partnership with financial institutions and NBFCs. I think that's extremely critical because most of the agri-tech models, particularly on the supply chain side, continue to be working capital intensive, right? And that's where working with large banks, public sector, private sector, and NBFC becomes extremely critical. So like players like Samunati, Caspian, Avanti, I think they've done a great job in building some of these models, but we need SBIs and Canara banks of the world to participate. Otherwise, it will be difficult for a lot of startups to scale. It's not just the cost of capital. I can tell you, even after borrowing at 15, 18%, they have made money. So it's more about excess of capital and also a mindset shift from the bank perspective. They are very used to conventional way of lending to agriculture. I think that has to transform a lot if we have to sort of catalyze more debt to the agri-tech startup. And the last one, which I want to highlight, is partnership with the state government, the local administration, the university next door, Krishi Vigyan Kendras. I think this is also one of those areas where some states have done better than others, but I think a lot to be done there as well. And I know a lot of startups face struggle, particularly, let's say, selling inputs to farmers. The kind of regulation which exists on storage, distribution of inputs, I think I think the number of licenses which a startup has to apply, I think is mind-boggling. So I think that process has to be eased out. And I think all said and done, the local administration at the district level plays a very, very important role. We realized that in lockdown, how important that was to keep the food supply chain running. So I think those are the areas, and probably I've been advocating for a state agri-tech policy, and sir also sort of alluded to it. I think we need an agri-tech policy of some sort, not for giving money to the startup, but essentially to catalyze some of these partnerships, for facilitation, for building some sort of infrastructure, both physical and digital, which can solve the problems of first mile and last mile access to farmers. So yeah, I think those are my thoughts. I do believe that partnerships are critical, will remain critical, and the models which will scale are going to be more collaborative than the ones who are trying to solve it on their own.
Hey, thanks, Hemendra. There are stuff that I've picked up, quite provocative in my mind. I'm going to bounce it off to all three of you. But before that, let me just ask Pratik. You've lived through the phases that Mark spoke about, and you are a survivor, and you've reached a certain scale now. So how are you, working with the new existing infra, the digital infra, the kind of opportunity for partnerships, and third, the more accommodative stance of say corporations and other intermediaries. How has it been on your journey?
Thanks, Srini, for giving us the opportunity to speak. So just to tell you that as Mark was saying that we are an entrepreneur, we would say that we've been into Agri from last 10 years, and we have felt that change really happening, because initially when we started off, I mean, we were more focusing towards the hardware solutions which we are having, right? So we had a solar pump controller which was IoT enabled, wherein we had the vision to extract the data from the farmers and provide them after sale services. And then we had a decentralized solar cooling system, which we believe that the farmers who are into horticulture and with especially this vegetables which are very perishables, they uh, go under immense pressure when the harvesting season comes, because everyone tries to look and target the nearby market of say 50 to 100-kilometer radius. So cooling the vegetables right after harvesting can actually extend the shelf life and then give them a bigger radius to market. So with those concepts, we were very much focused on developing the hardware. And that time, the very first prototype, I think Wilgrow incubated us, and then Omnivore invested into us, and then we were able to successfully demonstrate both the products on the field. In case of solar controller, the IoT part of it was something which we realized that since, as Mark was talking about, it was more of B2B2C. Okay, so we were selling it to, say, we are currently also selling it to L&T, Mahindra, Tata, who are basically reaching out to the farmers and they are providing the end solutions to them. Okay, but what we do is basically we have seen is that the cost of the overall system in the solar pumps, right? It was not affordable for the farmers to pay for the whole money. So government stepped in, and there is a big policy which came from the government, which is called as Kusum Yojana, wherein government is aggressively pursuing, and they are seeing that every state is having certain funds to deploy this solar pump so that their dependency on the electric pumps goes. And that basically brought this scale, and we started selling it to B2B companies, and we have done a decent scale in the solar pumping market. While parallelly we were doing solar cold rooms, we realized that the initial capex for the farmers becomes the bottleneck for them to basically adopt to that technology. Now we thought of that, how can we break that problem, right? So we thought, let's think of a rental or a leasing model. Now when you talk about the rental and the leasing model, again, when you're paying say for a month rent, how do you get that money? That confidence needs to come to the farmer. Now someone needs to pay in the supply chain. So at the end of the day, when you're dealing in a supply chain, right, the perishables will be grown by the farmers, then it will move from point A to point B, and in the point B there will be different stakeholders again. Then there will be wholesalers, then there will be retailers, and then it comes to the consumers, and the consumers needs to basically see that there is a value, and if he pays, then it gets again percolated back, right? So we initially started giving them all sort of post-harvest management techniques and whatnot, right, to make them comfortable around that. Okay, this is how you could increase the shelf life of the produce. They were successful, but we realized that there were only few farmers who were showing confidence for the market linkages. So we were successful in case of solar cold rooms in flower market, because in flowers market, what was happening was that the farmers were a little progressive. So someone sitting in Pune, whom we were providing solar cold room on a rental basis, was able to find a market in Hyderabad, and he was able to make money and paid us handsome amount. In fact, upfront amount. We don't have to go again and again to collect from him those monthly rentals as well. But when we tried to scale it up, we realized that market linkage is a bigger problem, because of which, if you so we thought of that, let's try to collaborate with B2B companies. Okay, so in case of flowers, we tried to target the biggest B2B companies. We sold them some of the pre-cooled roses. So pre-cooled is basically cooling it immediately after harvesting and then selling it to them to show them that there is a difference. We tried to show it to other B2B companies as well. I don't want to name it, for different commodities like lychees, strawberries. But what we realized was that, I mean, we were not getting the right feedback, because people were saying that, okay, I will pay the same amount as what it is coming as a non-pre-cool. And because of that, the whole model was getting on a stress. So then we decided that let's go directly. Okay, let's now we have started a third vertical called Eco Connect, wherein we see that we are directly getting engaged with the retailers, the wholesalers, and we're selling those pre-cooled materials which the farmers are using, are growing by using our cold rooms directly to them. And the feedback which we are getting, there is a recurring demand which is coming for the grapes, the strawberries which are pre-cooled. So that is making us iterate our model very fast. So now once we have shown that, there are certain interests which you're getting for the collaboration. So I would say that it's like more of expecting from the day one that a B2B company would come and collaborate with you and will give you the right value for your technology or for the offerings which you are giving could be wrong. You will have to first prove it. You have to taste it, because once you go and prove it, we also realize that certain tweaking has to be done in our model as well, because some things are theoretical. Like as an entrepreneur, we are very much passionate about our technology, right? We are very much, so because we have developed it, so we are seeing it only from that lens. But once you get into the supply chain, when you try to onboard all the stakeholders on your own, you will realize that these are the tweakings which you have to do. Now, once you have done that, now if you want to scale it up, then a lot of collaborations and the doors can open. So you don't need to then tackle everything on your own. So like, for example, the BLE model, you can start the FPOs model at the back-end side. And on the front-end side, there are a lot of companies who already have the retailer networks, right? Who have already burned money into the retailer networks. So you may look to collaborate with them. You may look to onboard yourself into Swiggy and then say that, okay, I will just try to sell this pre-cooled materials into that. So there are a lot of innovative ways by which you may not have to go to the same phase which others have gone to. But yeah, in order to prove your value proposition, I think you will have to get into it. Otherwise, people don't accept it. So that is what we have learned over a period of this 10 years, that if you want to basically prove it to people that your solutions are actually valuable, you have to see the end consumers and you have to have some feedback loop directly coming from it. If you depend upon any B2B or someone to get that feedback loop, it just extends your time, and sometimes you also go into the wrong direction as well.
You're bang on, Pratik, because I'm going to, there's stuff that I've inferred and also things that I heard in the previous session that Duncan mentioned is, the biggest point you're saying here is their value, right? Will at the end of the day, the consumer has to pay for it. And like what you've discovered has happened, say, in bananas. Today, you will find these spotless bananas in supermarkets, right? Or if you see the entire industry of how milk, the new categories of A2 and organic, and at 70 rupees plus a liter, people are building some scale, and I get that point. But I'm also actually opening it up as a reflection, and each of the other three to respond. I'm sensing that there is an unsaid assumption by startups that the old is stodgy, right? The old here being the existing MSME sector, because food processing has been around for a while, right? Or the existing ways of channels of reaching out. It really is a non-profit implementation partner logic. Today it is discovered and someone like a Dehat is using it, but it's old hat. Is there an assumption by startups saying that old is stodgy, we shouldn't even be looking at it? That's one. Corollary to it is, what have startups done to start looking at new job definitions? Like, for example, when the satellite television network started, suddenly now you have technicians in rural markets. You have dish TVs satellite dishes in every small little house. So there are new jobs, new definitions being created. So either of you, Mark, Hemendra, or Professor, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. I don't think anyone thinks that small food processors, FPOs, and the SME sector in general is stodgy or old or not worth working with. If I look at just our portfolio, right, whether it's VLEs or a player like Farmly that is working with FPOs on one side, right, in the dry fruit sector, and SME processors on the other. No, I think everyone is very happy to work with the incredible, right, small scale entrepreneurs that sort of define the Indian economy. I think that's very different from working with corporates. I think some corporates are good. Most corporates are like the scorpion and the frog. They will kill you because it's their goddamn habit. They do not know how to work with startups. They're getting better, and full marks to ThinkAg and Hemendra for all of that. But for the most part, they are, I would argue, fairly lethal and for startups. And in many cases, right, consciously sabotaging startups, castrating startups, destroying startups before they can scale. And if I were in a bad mood, I'd start naming names. And Hemendra's sitting there and he knows exactly who I'm talking about. So I think the point is that nobody is concerned about working with the SME sector. It's the corporates that are the problem. Some of them are good. The MNCs tend to be better because they've picked up some habits from abroad where they do work with startups and in some occasions acquire startups. But one of the things that we're dealing with in our sector right now is the fact that large domestic companies are for the most part predators.
Wow, okay. That's an interesting way of putting it, because I'm getting a sense a lot of the startups are between a rock and a hard place, right? Hold on to that. I see your face, but Hemendra, do you want to, or Professor, do you want to just respond to this? Are there fundamentally new job definitions? When I say job definition, it's almost like, say, I gave some examples earlier, even paramedics, right? So today, you want folks who are not skilled in medicine, but you're doing like, in EMRI. And are there new such opportunities which are created such that we're not just going with the old structures? And is that going to be of benefit?
Yeah, so Srini, I just want to, I think it's an interesting thought to pick. And all I want to say, look, agri-tech, of course, is new, but it has the potential to embark multiple entrepreneurial models in rural areas. I think that's critical. And I think that's probably one theme which got missed in the narrative of new farm laws, and it become much more debatable than it should have. So let's say of course Dehat is one example, and which most of the people know, that they're working with maybe 1,500 odd micro entrepreneurs. I won't be surprised if they work with maybe 15,000 in time to come. Look at dairy industry, one industry which needs the second white revolution, and a lot of it is going to be driven by how the cattle nutrition shapes up. And for that to shape up, you need silage. We are very short on fodder. Our productivity is going to go nowhere if we don't address that. But we need silage entrepreneurs, who can make silage, who can keep it, and who can. And it's a bulky product. It can't be a centralized facility for making silage. It has to be decentralized. So I think we need maybe hundreds and thousands of those models. Look at the milk, the milk post production. We know the milk quality challenges, whether it's cooperative, private dairies. I think they will all admit that lot to be desired. So we need to get bulk coolers, chillers closer to the farms, right? A 300 liter, a 500 liter, 1,000 liter, and 2,000 liters. So we need guys who can run that, manage that, right? Cold storage, of course, Pratik can talk much more about it, so I won't get there. But let's say dehydration. That's another one area which is, I see a huge potential, and I work with some of the startups like as far as they've demonstrated. Women farmers, which as far as works with, earn 3,000 rupees a month extra just by dehydrating fruits and vegetables. So, and I can go on and on. Beekeeping, sericulture, So I think so we should look at agri-tech. I think the potential of agri-tech in terms of creating entrepreneurial models or indirect jobs, whatever you want to call it, is far higher than I see in many other sectors, right? So I think we should probably look at from that lens, and whether that will I want to just comment on what Mark said. Yes, I think the challenge with corporates is, look, with micro entrepreneurs, with SMEs, one entrepreneur is talking to another entrepreneur, and that's where the decision making is kind of fast, and they understand the challenges, they can relate to it. When it comes to corporates, you're talking to professionals, right? And it's tough, because they have to navigate the hierarchy, and the decision making is slow. You are in fact questioning some of the jobs. Let's say quality assessing, digital quality assessing. If it gets integrated into a corporate environment, a lot of jobs on the procurement side may get lost because you don't need that many people.
Yeah,
that's where some sort of conflicts start arising. But of course, corporates are learning, and I tend to agree. Yes, it's a tough nut to crack, but I think the best part is corporates are realizing that their growth is not going to come in the way they have been doing business forever.
at that point, actually, I'm just interrupting you there because something which struck me sharing another previous panel was this. When someone said, I think startups should first get into shape before they start looking at scale. Are our startups getting into shape first? I don't know. I have a mixed feeling about it. But the bigger point for me, I realized in this conversation, and I think I would want Professor to comment on it, is we had looked at agri-tech is just as agri-tech. But if again use an example, say from the manufacturing or automobile world, a truck is different from a car, but both use axles, right? Both use the same steering systems and so on. Are we painting it too broad? Like, for example, when Prateek spoke about how in floriculture, pre-cooled started making sense right from the first day, but it took a bit of time before you could do the pre-cooled, say, in lychees or strawberries. Each of this is actually different sectors. So, Professor, in your point on scale versus replication or even in your policy, does it make sense to actually see maybe replication makes sense, but we are looking at agri is too vast, it's too broad a brush that we're painting?
Yeah, so I mean, I find the discussion quite interesting. So when I mentioned replicability, I did not want to downplay the role of scale. I mean, I just wanted to highlight the fact that, as Hemendra also said, and so did Mark, that there are so many business models that are being tried about. And if you start looking at it, they are being tried in different locations because the contexts are very different. The crops are different, in this case, flour versus something else. In certain cases, the organizational structures may be different in the sense that FPOs are more mature versus they are not mature, whether the mandis are in place or not in place. So the point that I was trying to make was that the heterogeneity and context specificity in agriculture is significantly more than in manufacturing. These standardization possibilities in manufacturing are significantly more than in agriculture, which means that the same model, the same technology may not work across different kinds of contexts. And therefore, one will have to think about what is replicable where and where one can scale. So those are not substitute possibilities, they can be complements. So look at Amul. Amul worked extremely well for milk. It did not work for oil. We don't know why that happened. I mean, so I don't know whether Prateek had to change the cooling technology significantly when he moved from, or tweak the technology when he moved from flour to something else, right? So for various kinds of situations, different solutions would become, useful. So in certain cases, corporates may be a good partner. In some cases, corporates may not be a good partner. And so that's what I had in mind. And the importance of linkages for me is very, very critical, because if you want to do everything, your capital requirements go through the roof. And very, very few companies will be able to get that, even if they want to scale up in that fashion. So if you want to have 1,000 flowers bloom with multiple models, multiple technologies, and various kinds of solutions, you have to have linkages. And I don't see any other solution to that. And some of those linkages would grow and become big in scale. Some of those linkages will stay small, but still be profitable. So, yeah.
Yeah, not everything is going to become a unicorn, as the media calls it. But there's a specific question, Hemendra, and maybe even Mark, you could say. Someone wants to know, do you have examples of corporates who have helped startup without being predatory? So, of course, then they're going to all beat a line to that company. But if you're comfortable, you could answer it, otherwise you can just pass that question.
I'll answer that question. I think, right, Hatson has been a terrific partner of Stellapps, and in fact has worked with many other startups as well in the dairy sector. And that's a domestic company; it's not an MNC, right? So, I think that some of the big four, in particular, BASF and Bayer, have worked really, really well with startups. I would say I don't want to toot my former employers, but Syngenta has done that quite well. I think Godrej Agrovet, which we came out of, has gotten better about it. I think it was very hard in the early days for them to understand how to work with startups, but I think that's picked up, especially in the last couple of years. So it's not that everyone is bad. It's just that a lot of people are bad. And again, it's not always nefarious. There are a couple players out there that if you ping me privately, I will warn you away from. But I think that in many other cases, right, it's just an inability to really understand where the startup is coming from, what the startup needs, right? And it's like an elephant accidentally stamping on a rabbit, right? Like they didn't mean to, but the rabbit's still dead.
You know what you're saying. So, I mean, this is something that I'm not blowing our own trumpet, but this is something at Willgrow we've been trying to sort of catalyze. And we're really happy to work with any startup, any VC in this space. We've been able to facilitate these conversations, help moderate it. For example, you spoke about Godrej Agrovet. I think we've had some great conversations. I mean, finally, it didn't end in a partnership with the startup, but they were quite understanding and accommodative. And we've also had a similar experience with another large domestic organization. It started slow and not so good, but today I think we are in a great place. But I'm not naming it because we've still not signed an agreement. The startup hasn't. But I've seen success. But I also understand many startups won't be able to get it because the cadence of your working is just going to be off. Likewise, as an investor, you might not have the bandwidth. Yeah. So and at this point, and this, so again, throwing it up to any of you is folks like a Willgrow, how could we help you in making this work? Right? At least the earlier days until you learn the ropes, and then the startup is on its way.
Yeah, Shini, before I answer the question, I also wanted to give one specific example on corporate partnership, which I found very interesting. I think it's the program by Marico through Marico Innovation Foundation. And I think, of course, they are choosy about the startup they want to work with, but they have a very interesting program where what they do, depending on the needs of the startup, they figure out a professional within the system, Marico system, who can work with the startup to solve for it. And it's not just restricted to agri startups. For all the startups, I know at least in 2 cases, they worked so closely, like in as far as they helped them set up an ISO certified factory. And as far as couldn't do that without Marico's help, right? And absolutely no, that's like a big blessing for a very young startup who doesn't know how to go about it. There's another company which is into different sector. They guided them on building their brand and distribution network, etc. So I think there are examples, and there are a lot of SMEs. I work with the FIL Industries out of J&K, with the Al Group in Western UP. They've opened their doors for technical validation. At least 15 odd startups have gone to them, working with them to validate their solutions through their network. And it's definitely not predatory, all I can say.
No, FIL, I engaged with FIL in a previous life. Those are great people up there.
Yeah. So I clearly there are those folks who are probably going to be the lighthouses, and maybe the others will learn from them over time. But I'd say one last question I want to share before I come back to the thing on how could investors and startups work with folks like us, which is, it could be either of you, Mark, Hemendra, or Pratik. What do you think, or which model works best? A full stack one-stop solution or specialized solutions? When I read it, I thought the answer is it depends.
Because that's the answer, right?
Yeah.
I think what's happening right now is that in different regions, in different subsectors, in different value chains, platforms, marketplaces, full stack plays are being built. And I think, because we have a different challenge in India than the agri-techs really do in the West, right? So if you think about the agri-techs in the West, there's a lot of biotech going on there. There's a lot of, incremental hardware solutions and software solutions, right? But we have 130 million farmers and an average farm holding of slightly over 1 hectare. Somebody needs to organize this. And if you look at a lot of the deal flow right now, it's platforms that are saying, I'll organize this. I'll organize Eastern India. if I'm Dehat, or I'll organize, right, post-harvest linkages if I'm NinjaCart in horticulture, or I'll organize aquaculture if I'm AquaConnect, or what have you. And I think, you know, if we look maybe 5 years from now, we're not going to see as many of these platforms. Some of these platforms will succeed and some will fail. But what net they'll do, along with corporates like ITC that have these ambitions, along with, you know, whatever the hell Geo decides to do, ultimately, we will have a more organized sector that has a digital layer built over this incredible fragmentation that we've all been working in for most of our careers. And so at that point, the ability to get a specialized solution to market will become a lot easier. The ability to get new biotech products to market, if we ever can have the GEAC work again, will become easier. The ability to get new biological products to market will become a lot easier, right? But right now, we're essentially building the base layer, building the foundation, building the digital stack.
Well, makes sense. Makes sense. In fact, as this conversation goes, I keep thinking back on what Professor said, and I can understand his meaning of replication more and more. And I think today we are at a place that more the merrier, because all of us are still building the foundation, and it's so vast, and there is, I mean, everyone's welcome as long as you execute well. But this challenge, I come back to the last point before I close, and Anusha jumps back in, is how do you think of an early stage supporter like us could help you and could help the startup?
Srini, I think we need more matchmakers. And of course, I'm doing out of ThinkAg, out of FICCI, out of Bharat, but we need many more matchmakers. So, and of course, like Subomni or Ankur, I think everyone is doing their job, but and I think I see a lot of consolidation happening in time to come. I can tell you at least 3 M&A in next 6 months, which I'm aware of in this sector. And I'm sure there'll be maybe half a dozen every year from now on. And it's not going to happen without people on the panel. I think that's for sure. So that's our job, and we need to do it together.
Prateek, anything?
What the group could do is that during the time when you guys are incubating, right? I think at that moment of time, if any model or any solution which a startup is working in, right? If some sort of because at that moment of time, if suppose the entrepreneur is really new, if he has just graduated from the college, right? He's more passionate about the solution which he has thought of. If some sort of based on a understanding of whether he's solving a foundation-based problem or he's trying to come up a incremental solution for something which is already existing. If that bucketing can be done, and if the startup can get into a direction of whether they want to get into a full stack model or they want to focus on their R&D or the hardware and the other things, if those directions can be really figured out at the initial stages, it would definitely help a startup. Because ultimately, otherwise, if you take a route for 5 to 6 years into something, and then you come up and realize that you're solving a very big problem which is very unorganized, and then you take a U-turn and come into a model of coming into full stack, you run out of
cash. Just going to interrupt because we're almost running out of time. Mark,
so that is something which you can do. It will be really helpful for any startup.
Thank you, Mark. Any last word before Anusha jumps in?
Tell young startups to avoid working with the government.
Okay, thank you.
It will screw their business models permanently.
Sure, thanks. Thank you, Anusha. I think we're almost out of time, but thanks a lot. I think there's some learning here and also some reflection for us on how we could sharpen our incubation work such that investors can start working with entrepreneurs faster, better. Yeah.
Keep these conversations going. Apart from matchmaking with Hemendra, as mentioned, keep these conversations going because all of us seem to think that we have the answer, but we don't.
Yeah. Sure. That's my job. I'll make sure of that. Yeah. I'm sorry I'm interrupting, but Anusha, could you take it away from here? Yeah.
Yes. So thank you, Mark, Hemendra, Professor Basant, Pratik, and Srinivas for such an informative session. This was certainly very insightful for agri-tech entrepreneurs on how they can create impactful businesses. Coming up next, we have a session on the scale conundrum in the circular economy and a masterclass on lessons in scale, taking Nephrophilus across the globe. We also have Dr. Satyamurthy and Anirudh from ITC waiting to network with entrepreneurs in the networking lounges. So please head over there and see you all again soon, and hope you all having a great day so far. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Bye.
Thank you, Hemendra.
Thank
you, Professor Pratik. Thanks. We are working on it. I mean, there are stuff that we want to start in paid pilots, support proving of prototypes. You are an early example, but we want to structure it and build on it, right? And but let me circle back and see how we can structure and build these things out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Hemendra. Thanks, Professor. Thank you, Pratik.